Nothing. Nothing but. Nothing but net.
Welcome to Nothing But Net, the podcast for triple net commercial real estate investing. Before we get into the meat of today's show, let's recap on why there's so much interest and buzz around net properties. Triple net properties are commercial real estate investments where the tenants, usually brand name corporations, pay you rent every month. Can you say mailbox money? In addition, they pay the real estate taxes, insurance, and maintenance for the property. No toilets, termites, or taxes. What's not to like? You can remember what net or triple net stands for by using TIM, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. With triple net properties, there's lower risk income and cash flow because rents are guaranteed by strong credit tenants. Preservation of wealth, because rent increases and property appreciation are bulwarks against inflation and a great store of value. Tax efficiency. The government wants investment in commercial real estate, so they provide inducements through depreciation and deductions which shelter income from taxation. Tax deferral, which gives potential for infinite tax deferral with 1031 exchanges, which are very popular in the triple net space. Triple net properties are a tangible asset, and as Mark Twain once said, buy land. They ain't making any more of it. Hello and welcome back to the Nothing But Net podcast, the podcast for triple net commercial real estate investing. I'm your host, Adam Carswell, joined by my co-host, Michael Flight. Guys, here we are. All your efforts to research and analyze the property have come to the place where you agreed on the price and terms with the letter of intent, which we just covered in the last episode. But now you need to complete a legally binding agreement as to how that sale will be finalized and ownership transferred. So this is written up as a purchase and sale agreement, PSA, also known as a purchase contract, contract for sale, or simply a contract. And to explain this is why we have him here. Happy to be joined once again by my co-host, our co-host today here, Michael Flight. Michael, how are you?
Hey, Adam. How you doing today? I am doing fantastic. You started out with guys, and I know that's a colloquialism for the Midwest, but we're going to talk to guys and girls. And if you don't understand that and you're from the South, we'll just say y'all.
There we go. Happy to have y'all here with us, digging into the PSA nitty gritty. You know, Michael, we've painted a nice picture up until this point on what it looks like putting together an offer and also sourcing the deal in the first place. But now it's time to really take it to the next level. Yes, I did use my catchphrase right there. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're doing here today?
Sure. Well, we are going to go through the purchase and sale agreement. We are going to explain it from a high level. Well, actually, we're going to go kind of get into detail, but it's going to be from a business person standpoint. I want to reiterate, and we've reiterated it in the past, we are not attorneys. We do not even play attorneys on TV. Nothing in this podcast should be relied upon for legal advice. What we just want to do is explain the major points of a contract and why they're necessary and why you, as a business person making this agreement, should understand at least the components of the contract. As always, obtain your own legal counsel and rely on their advice and knowledge. This should not be a substitution for any type of legal services or legal advice.
Can you imagine? That'd be kind of funny if someone, like, something went wrong and they would try to blame it on the Nothing But Net podcast.
That's why we hope you get value out of this. I'm telling you, there's brilliant legal minds out there. We are not them. We've been doing this for a while and know a little bit. In the last podcast, Adam, you and I discussed, should you do a purchase offer right away or should you do an LOI? In a lot of situations, some of the larger real estate brokerage companies and institutional property managers will utilize a data room. And so they'll have their own version of the contract that they want you to use. So they'll make you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Sometimes it's when download the offering memorandum, and then they'll open up the data room to you. At other times, it's like the point you are making an offer or you've signed an LOI, they'll open up the data room. They'll say, you're going to use the form LOI and you're going to agree to use this. If it's competitive bidding process with a few buyers, the seller may sometimes pick, as we talked about in the past, it's a beauty contest sometimes. They might pick the purchaser with the least amount of changes to the PSA if it still meets their pricing terms and requirements. With that, we'll start to go through it. Do you have any questions before we start, Adam?
Well, you did mention changes to the PSA right there. I'm curious, when going through the negotiations of a PSA, what's common as far as the back and forth between buyer and seller? Is there normally a lot of changes, or is it just depend on the situation?
It really, number one, depends on the situation. Number two, it depends if they have some sort of insane, PSA, which are like has all these details that not something that you can comply with, then, you're either going to waste time making changes to it or just say, this seller is not for me and they're probably not worth the time to invest in it. And we'll move on to the next property. Because that's the other thing is once you're negotiating a PSA, sometimes certain sellers or certain buyers will feel compelled to make changes to it because they know you're already bought into it, the psychology of negotiation and everything. It's like, okay, they just want to get it done. They know they need to get it done. Sometimes people will try to renegotiate different deal points. And so you should always remember that there's many, 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 many properties out there. And if it's not this one, it'll be the next one. So you should always go in with a mindset that it's like, I'm going to close this. I'm going to get this done. I know I can get it done. But if they start, messing around with it, or if they try to the deal goes sideways at some point in time, I can tell you we've pulled out of a few of them, especially when the ownership was acting a little unethically and, changing the terms of the deal because they thought we were more than invested in it and we weren't willing to walk away. And we did. And then there was other ones where that mindset really helped us in, getting some better terms because of the fact that particular specifics of the property had changed. And so the financial dynamics of the property had changed. And so we had to change the purchase price because of what we had discovered in our due diligence. It just helped that the mindset was, this is what, with this new information, what we can pay for this. And this is what our return requirements are. This is what we found. You either accept this or you move on to the next person. Then there was a really, really long silence of about close to 2 minutes. And the other person was the first person to speak. They agreed to our new terms. So
wow.
That's just some of the things that can happen. The fun stuff.
The power of silence.
I've heard other people say that this isn't true, but I've found that a lot of times if you say something and then just stop. So, for example, I heard in the 2 Comma Club, if you just say stop, people will listen to you. No, if
2 Comma Club, is that your new favorite bar?
It used to be a comedy club, and then they lost their comedy license. So if you put it out there and you say, this is what my position is, and then if you don't talk, usually the first person that talks loses. But we should probably get into this purchase and sale agreement, and then we can probably backtrack and do an entire, probably should do an entire thing on negotiating, bring in some people that are really excellent negotiators. My partner, Corey, was one of the best negotiators I've ever met. So,
yep.
But anyways, let's move on with purchase and sale agreement.
Okay, let's do it. So, to kick things off, what are we looking at here with the step-by-step process?
Well, you need to start out with the agreement and who the agreement is between. You're always going to have at the top who the parties to the agreement are. The parties could be individuals or corporations, which also include LLCs, trusts, or other entities that can legally own real estate. And then to further identify who is doing the buying and selling, you usually include the location. So for example, Liberty Real Estate Fund, LLC, was making this contract. It would be also listed as a Delaware limited liability company. And so the seller also would be listed as, if it was Adam Carswell, it would be where he legally resided. And so then the main thing that we want to make sure we have in here, most of the time we make the offer, and the Liberty Real Estate Fund LLC, it can contract a purchase with it, but we also want the ability to nominate or assign the contract to somebody. And it's usually we assign it to as we had discussed last week, a single member LLC that is just there. It's a special company that is just there to own this particular asset. The other thing that has happened in the past, when real estate prices were shooting up, we had been able to get property under contract, and then we are able to turn around and basically sell the property for a higher amount by assigning our contract to somebody else, taking some of the, taking some or all the difference. So when things are really popping, that might be an opportunity, but that's why we have that in there.
All right. Got it. What's next after that portion?
Well, then you typically get into an area, it might say recitals, but you have to identify the exact property that you're purchasing. What we really like to do is if we're using our contract, we not only put the postal address in, so we would call it the common address, but we also add the parcel numbers. So it would be the assessor's parcel number or the property index number. And so if there was one or there was 5 total parcels that were included, those are typically, what people are paying real estate taxes on. Then we also want to add in, the approximate amount of acres for the property, because we have had it where we thought we were buying one thing. They're like, well, no, it's a much smaller parcel. It's like, well, that wasn't clearly identified on the offering memorandum. So we like to put that on there as well, just so that there's more of a description on it. And then we also use the survey plat, because that would come up, or we like to attach as an exhibit, and this should be in every contract, the legal description. And the legal description basically takes the latitude and longitude, and it's your meets and bounds that they call off of the survey. That says exactly where it is. So it's actually much more legal than a postal address.
Wow. That description right there is very detailed, and I can see how that would help clarify confusion between the two parties. And it's interesting what you said too about how in the past, or maybe you've been through a deal where it wasn't clarified and there was some confusion.
Yeah, the big thing is the contract, you're not only exchanging money, but you're exchanging money for a very particular piece of property. You want to have as much of the description on there as possible, so that in case things really, really, really go sideways, that, it's like, well, this is what we thought we were buying, and this is what you guys are delivering, so we have an issue here. And then the other thing following on that is we talk about what actually the seller is selling. So, and this is a key thing with single tenant net lease properties, because that lease could be in the form of a ground lease, which you would only be buying the land, or it could also be in the form of the land and the building, and the tenant is leasing the building from you. In both cases, the tenant could be paying for everything and maintaining everything. But in one case, the tenant built the building, the tenant owns the building, you do not own the building. In the other case, where it is a triple net single tenant lease, but you are buying the building, the tenant is just renting the building. And then you want to make sure that somewhere in here that when you are describing what you are buying, that you're buying, if you are buying the building, you buy the building, all the land and appurtenances, and subject to the lease, because you want to name the tenant lease because you want the lease. And then if you're financing the property, the lender is going to want to make sure that what you are buying is that lease, because the most valuable piece at this part of the deal is that long-term lease for most of the time. So, okay. And I hope that's helpful to you.
Yeah, thank you. Moving through the PSA, what is the next step now? You're
going to go through the terms. So the major term that everybody usually negotiates on and comes to an agreement with, the LOI, is the purchase price. So you're going to give them a purchase price, and then you're going to give any type of, if there's any type of terms For example, the purchase price could list out how much you're going to pay in total and then how much money you're going to pay in earnest money deposit. And sometimes I've seen it and we've done it. You put down a smaller purchase money deposit until the end of the due diligence period. And then after the due diligence period, or sometimes called a feasibility period, you would put up a more significant amount because the seller wants to make sure that you show up to close. And so if the earnest money deposit is really not a substantial amount, people could just decide that they want to walk away from it for some reason. It kind of splits the baby. You put up a smaller amount, which means that it's going to be difficult to walk away from it. And then when you're really ready to close, you put up the rest of the earnest money.
Okay, nice. I didn't know that was a part of a contract, because normally any contract you hear about the maybe one earnest money deposit. So is this the only sector of commercial real estate where you see something like this?
No, you do see it in larger properties, larger commercial real estate properties, and it really just depends on what's customary. But it's not an uncommon thing. If it's a smaller, easier single tenant deal, sometimes that's just getting way too fancy. Sometimes you should just say, this is what the earnest money is. They might come back and say, I want you to put up a little bit more. You would ask where negotiating points are. Negotiating points can be, we want you to put up more earnest money because we don't want you to just walk away. It always says so you're putting up the earnest money, and then it'll typically say the balance will be paid at closing. And then you want to make sure that the deposit says it will be applied to the purchase price, because you don't want some misunderstanding that they come back and say, oh, well, that was, in addition to the purchase price. And then you get into the next section.
All right. Which section would that be?
Well, it's sometimes called the due diligence period. Other people will call it a feasibility period. Some people will just call it a feasibility study. Typically, we'll want to have some time because you want to verify that everything that the seller has told you is correct. So you're going to go and do your own clarification on that. As part of this due diligence, you're going to want to see the full lease, any type of amendments. You're going to want to make sure that you get any type of financial documents that the seller has that will show you. You want to ask them if they have environmental studies, because if they have environmental studies that are really scary, you might just choose to end the deal right there and not go through with.
What would a scary environmental study look like?
Well, in certain situations, let's say you were buying a Montessori school, which are popular, or some sort of daycare center or something like that. And then let's say that the environmental study came back and showed that there was a dry cleaner underneath there. Well, the dry cleaning fluid sometimes goes into the air and creates toxic stuff. So in most cases, most states would not allow you to put that type of use on top, anything with children on top of a contaminated building. So you might even be buying a lease that is going to expire in 3 years, and you think you've got this tenant to put in. And so you just want to make sure that there's no environmental issues. Another thing is that 7-Elevens, are famous for going in areas because they want to go on corners. And a lot of those corners were occupied by gas stations at one point in time. And gas stations used to have metal tanks, and those metal tanks would rust away. You'd have a lake of gasoline underneath the property. We've even had in older properties where they used to use heating oil that we had leaking underground storage tanks from heating oil. So just that type of thing, so that would be an issue. You want to make sure that if you are going to get financing, that your lender, their questions are answered. You're going to need an appraisal, and you're going to want an appraisal. Even if you're buying it cash, you're going to want an appraisal because that's just going to help you verify and give you more information.
And I know you might touch on this too, but I am curious out of the things that you're referencing here. And I think you referenced some of these even in the past couple episodes, but can you highlight within what you're saying, the levels that you wouldn't commonly see in multifamily, mobile home parks, these other asset classes? What are the points here that we're focusing on that are specific to triple net lease properties?
The main thing that you would be focusing on that you would be doing all of this for all of those properties. The main difference is with the mobile homes and the apartments, you would be looking at one of the master leases and you would just do a tenant audit to make sure that the leases that they say they are actually there and paying rent. Here, you want to look at the exact lease and you want to look at the terms of the lease and you want to make sure that the lease is, number one, triple net lease, because a lot of these, as we've discussed before, the broker doesn't know what a triple net lease is. And so we'll say, yeah, it's a triple net lease, when in fact, you as the purchaser and eventual owner of it could end up having to replace the roof for the tenant. There could be a special thing inside the lease that says the tenant's responsible for maintaining the HVAC, which is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. But when it comes right down to it, if there's a major component like a compressor or the entire HVAC unit needs to be replaced, or if it's within 3 years of the end of the lease, then the landlord will have to replace the HVAC. You just want to take a look at some of that stuff and make sure. And you very, 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 very much want to make sure that the tenant doesn't have any right of cancellation. Because there's certain leases, especially with retail leases, where the tenant has a right to terminate the lease if they are not doing the sales amount that they name in the lease. So it's basically a termination option based on the fact that they're not doing enough sales at the property, so they can just, exercise their option to leave. Or if they're right around that number, but just below it, what they normally do is come back to you and say, well, we're not quite making our sales. So in order for us to stay here, why don't you just reduce the rent for us, and then we won't exercise our termination option. So
right, you don't want to be in that situation.
No. So those are some of the things that would be different from even a industrial tenant. But you're going to run into a lot of the same situations if you're doing a office triple net lease or a industrial tenant triple net lease. You probably won't run into these things with self-storage, multifamily, or mobile home parks, because they don't have this type of where the lease and the tenant credit is more important.
Okay, cool. So you were kind of going through the checklist of what you'll need to do during this due diligence period. Was there anything else that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, at a bare minimum, you're going to need a boundary survey. And we always do an ALTA survey, because an ALTA survey is an American Land Title Association survey. And that is what, if you are putting any type of financing on the property, the lender is going to want an ALTA survey and not just a boundary survey. So an ALTA survey not only gives you the boundaries, but it also has all the easements, and they actually put everything that shows up on the title. They add that to the survey. And so the big thing, and this is where your attorney is going to get involved, is title searches. So they're going to want to make sure that there's nothing marring the title. They're also going to want to make sure that the property is zoned for the use. We have had several things where the tenant decided to change their business model. The zoning didn't comply with that. So for example, we had Walgreens, which did add liquor stores in I think the 1980s or 1990s. So they sold liquor. I don't believe they sell any liquor now. In certain places, liquor was like half of their business. So it turns out that the property on this one particular property was too close to a school. So they weren't supposed to be selling liquor, so they needed to get a license, and so they needed a variance for the property. And so we now, with that property, have the variance. But that's just, you want to make sure that that tenant and any future uses. So some of the zoning, you need to make sure, because some of the zoning is conditional use based on that particular tenant. And if that particular tenant leaves, like let's say it's like a Longhorn Steakhouse, and Longhorn has an alcohol use. But if it's just conditional for Longhorn only, if Longhorn leaves and you say, oh, I can, just release this to another restaurant tenant. If it's a sit-down restaurant like Longhorn, they might do a lot of their business, like a Chili's does a lot of their business with their specialty drinks, because they mark up those specialty drinks to like $20 and everybody get a straw and sip out of it. And so that's, a major part of their business model. If they can't sell alcohol, or if it's a gas station and it's not zoned for gas or automotive use, those are the things that are going to really show up in a title search. The other thing that's going to show up in a title search is if there's any easements. In a shopping center, you want to make sure that there are what's called reciprocal easement agreements so that people can drive through the shopping center to get to the out parcel or the out pad. And you want to make sure that people from the shopping center, you can just get back and forth. Because otherwise, if there's not a reciprocal easement agreement, at some point, the shopping center, if somebody else comes in there, they could put up a fence around your property, and so nobody can actually get to the tenant that you've got there that depends on people driving and parking at it.
Got it. And is that, have you seen a situation where not paying attention to something like that has come back to haunt someone?
Yeah, I've seen situations where people have bought a property and somebody had built additional out structures or additions to the building, and the town allowed it to go through. And then when the next person bought the property, after they closed on it and they were applied for an occupancy permit, the town came back and said, oh, by the way, this is an illegal structure, so you have to knock this down. So you really, really, really need to have somebody, and that's really, it was a title issue. There's other situations where people took a piece of the land and all the rest of that stuff, and that's why there is title insurance for some of those things that do come up. I don't do as much title as somebody out there that really would know what they're talking about from a title company, but it's number one, you need a good title company, and you need an attorney that can read a title.
Okay, so what point in the agreement are we at now?
Typically, a seller is going to want an indemnification, because if you are going to go onto their property and do studies, so for example, if you're going to do a property condition report, and that person doing the property condition report is going to have to go up on the roof, and if somebody falls off the roof or somebody gets hurt doing something, the seller does not want to be liable for your contractors going on. So they're going to want some sort of indemnification. We usually also ask for an indemnification from the seller in certain situations. The definite thing is that you're going to have to indemnify the seller against something that you do. Another thing that comes up commonly is if your environmental report pulls up a problem where they have to do drilling, then you're definitely going to have to get the property, and you want to still go through with the deal. You cannot do any drilling or anything like that without the seller's permission. So that's something that might come up. We've seen issues like that.
All right. Indemnification process or portion that's written in the agreement?
It's written in the agreement. And the other thing that all of these contracts, and we'll just say purchaser or the seller is going to want you to have insurance before you even start stepping on their property. Mm-hmm. And the seller is going to want you to name them as an additional insured, so that in case something goes wrong, they're covered under your insurance.
Got it.
So following up on that, if you find something that you do not like about the property, what our contracts normally say is that if we're at all unhappy with anything, we discovered something we don't like, it's not going to work, we want the right to cancel, at any time, for that reason. Some sellers will say, well, we'll give you the right to cancel for these specific reasons. We want it to read that we have the right to cancel for any reason whatsoever if we're unsatisfied. And just to go back to due diligence periods, sometimes people will, if they're super fast and they've got all their stuff together and they know they really want the property, I've seen due diligence periods as short as 10 days. I've seen, some due diligence periods 15 days. A typical and not unreasonable due diligence period is 30 days. But it really depends on, how much competition you have for that property. And if you're not capable of doing that and you don't have the contractors put together and you don't have the staff to do that, then you should definitely not agree to a 10-day due diligence period unless you fully think that you can close then. You get to the end of the due diligence period and you haven't exercised your option to terminate, you're going through with buying that property, whether you did a good due diligence or not.
Wow, good to know. I know you've got some hot pro tips for us to finish off this episode. There's probably some more of the PSA that we got to get through here. Where are we at in the agreement now?
Well, you're going to want to put some sort of time limit on the seller delivering the documents to you, because you don't want to agree to a due diligence period and then the seller doesn't get you all the documents that you need. So you're going to want to say, let's say seller shall deliver to purchaser no later than 5 business days after the full signing, what we would call the commencement date, or some people will call it the execution of the contract. You want copies of all the leases. You want any amendments that were on the leases. You want the liability insurance policy. So because typically the liability insurance and the property insurance is going to be in the tenant's name. And so you're going to want to make sure that that's in effect. You're going to want to ask for any engineering studies that they've had done. So that might be not only structural engineering, but also if they built it and it was built, put some sort of extra fill underneath it because there was unstable soils or anything like that. You want environmental studies, any surveys, and any easements or cross easements related to the property. You want to ask them, they're supposed to deliver you a recent title insurance policy. So you're going to just request that stuff. Okay.
Okay. What next?
Well, we're going to talk about closing. One of the bigger things that you're going to want to name in there is when the closing is going to happen. Typically, the closing is going to happen after the due diligence period is completed. So the closing can sometimes be as fast as 1 day or 5 days after completion of the due diligence period. I've also seen it where there's a 30 or 60 day due diligence period if it's like really a complex transaction, and then it's 30 days after that. This very rarely happens, but in certain situations, people will put a financing contingency for the property, which means that you are not going to go through with the purchase unless you can obtain financing. And so financing is normally never usually able to be completed within 30 days. Sometimes it is, but more likely your financing period is going to have to be 60 days. So depending on the competition, again, for the property, a lot of sellers are just going to say, I am not going to do a financing contingency. You can buy it and you can, finance it, but I'm not going to get involved with that. And then other sellers that if they really need to sell or are having a tough time moving their property, they might agree to the financing contingency. And then you're going to say, we're going to close, and the closing is going to specify what kind of deed you're going to get. So there's a number of different deeds. You're also going to want to specify that it's free from any liens or anything else that might restrict you from operating the property the way you intend to operate the property. So that would come up as part of your due diligence, but it should say that that's how the person is going to have to deliver it. Some other legal issues that might happen, but typically don't happen. One of the things that has happened in the past is you go under contract with the property, 30 days later, condemnation comes through so that, the town or the county or the state condemns the property. So you're going to want to have, some sort of contingency in the document on that. The other thing that you're going to want to have is what happens if the property is destroyed while it's under contract. Do you have to follow through with the purchase? Do you get to rebuild? Do you get the insurance proceeds? So that might come up a certain amount of time. Other issue that's a big issue is how are you going to prorate the expenses to the property? Now, it's not as big of a deal here because it is all paid for by the tenant. You just want to make sure that your water, your property taxes, your insurance, and everything is adjusted. So if we close on our property on July 1st, that's the seller is responsible for the first 6 months of expenses, and the new purchaser is responsible for the next 6 months. And one
Okay.
thing relating to property taxes, and the title company will more than likely not allow it to close unless this has happened. You want to make sure that the property taxes have been paid as agreed.
Okay. All very valuable things to know. One thing coming to mind here too, this is a little bit of a step back, but in general, especially with a single tenant, triple net lease property, as far as the closing and really just this entire process that we're looking at here today with the PSA, on average, normally how long would you estimate it takes for a single property?
It really depends. A lot of single tenant triple net deals are done what we call 1031 exchanges. And so those people are in a hurry to purchase and they've already got their cash available and they need to make that exchange go through as fast as possible. So a lot of net deals, as we're talking about here, are done all cash. There's also a lot of real estate investment trusts and institutional investors that will buy, and they'll buy all cash. So these typically close faster than other properties that you might see out there. Just because there's not as many moving parts, it's basically making sure the lease is in effect and all the rest of it. So I can't give you a standard answer to that, but I can say universally, it seems like 30-day due diligence period is your basic standard. And then anything longer than that is a deviation from the standard. And anything shorter from that is a deviation from the standard.
Okay. Also good to know. And you mentioned 1031 exchanges. That's a little bit of a sneak peek to our next episode.
Yeah, with a special guest.
So, all right. I know you've got some hot pro tips for us here getting near the end. Was there anything else in the PSA that you wanted to cover?
No, the rest of it, would typically be default and notices and, all your standard language. A lot of it's going to be specifically addressed by the attorneys. If you are doing an exchange and it's part of a 1031 exchange, you're going to want to make sure that that is in there. And the other thing is, if there's a broker involved, they're going to want to make sure, because legally they have to be named in a lot of this stuff. You might have to add, if you've got a buyer's broker in there and they're going to get paid, you need to make sure that they're in there. Certain states and certain people require arbitration before you can, sue in a contract. We typically do not do an arbitration clause because we find it just wastes a lot more money. And then, as always, in most contracts, time is of the essence. So if it says a date, it says these things need to be done by that certain date. It has to be done by that certain date. So if you've got a 10-day due diligence period and you agree to that and you come back at 11 days and say, wait, I decided I don't want to do this, you're legally obligated to buy, and it depends on what the seller wants to do.
Okay, so as I've been kind of advertising here throughout the interview, I know you have some big takeaways for us throughout this process. What do you think, or what are these important points that you have to make?
Really, you need specific wording, and it must include the price. It must include the time, as we said, to get the deal completed, plus any other conditions of the contract. You must make sure that the other selling party has the legal right to sell the property. And in some situations, people use a power of attorney. So you need to make sure that your attorney needs to make sure that the power of attorney is written correctly and that they actually have the right to sell the property. Because if you're dealing with an individual or a trust, somebody might decide to sell a property and not have the approval of somebody else that also has a right to a say-so in that. This is just basic 101 contracts. Everything must be written down. And so if it's not in this agreement, and you can't come back and say, well, you told me that we could do this. If you discuss something and you think that's an important point, it should be written down in the contract. We need to make sure that, there's a detailed description of the property. As we talked about before, you want to make sure that all the structures are legal. You've got a legal description of the property so that you absolutely make sure that what you're buying is there. You need to make sure that, that you have the lease and you understand the lease, because the lease is the main financial instrument involved in what you're buying. If you do have a mortgage contingency, you want to make sure that's included in there. And the date, time, and place of the closing, must be specified. And the other thing is, if you are supposed to be ordering the survey, you better order the survey as soon as possible, because they usually take longer to do. If you're ordering an environmental report or any other types of reports, you, upon signing the contract and putting your money down, should have those people lined up and ready to go. Because those, especially if they're busy and you've got a short time window, you just have to make sure that you can get those people. And that's why I say it's really tough to do a 10-day closing unless you've got an absolute team put together that says, yeah, I can do this and I'm available.
Unless you have a team put together like the Liberty Fund team that you've constructed.
We still need outside contractors because we don't have on staff surveyors and the consultants. So we still depend on people doing that. We have great relationships with all those people. But as I said before, when things are really popping, those people sometimes get really busy. And so you could say, yeah, I'll agree to 10 days. And then you find out that your entire team that you depend on to do all your due diligence and actually go visit the property and do the environmental and stuff like that, they can't get it done for, because it's not only going out and actually doing it, but they have to research the property with a surveyor. They have to research the title, and then they go out and actually do it. And then they have to write up the report or draw the survey. So it's not just a matter of, I can just look this up all on the internet and I'm done.
Valuable information, Michael. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Getting near the end here, any closing remarks or things you'd like to wrap up on?
One thing that, in case somebody doesn't know what a closing is for real estate, it means that all the conditions of the contract have been met and the buyer shows up with the money and the seller shows up with the title. And it's typically done in an attorney's office or in a title company office. And they exchange the money and one person walks away with the title, the other person walks away with the money. And so that's what a closing is. We're going to close this episode out with the closing.
Nice. As we mentioned, sneak peek into the next episode, we're going to be focused on 1031 exchanges. If you wanted to give a teaser for that as well, Michael.
He's been a friend of mine for a while. He absolutely is one of the best, net lease brokers in the business. And he, in fact, even his telephone number ends in 1031. But so he's going to give us some really great information. And for those people that are getting tired of hearing us talk, we are going to be bringing on experts on other areas of expertise that we think can shed even more light on this. So we intend on bringing some people in from the tenant side so they can explain what they look for when they're out negotiating a property or trying to do a lease with a particular thing, so that you get some insight into how things, if it's a good location or a bad location, from the eyes of the tenant. So we've got a lot of great things planned, and we thank you very much for listening.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to the Nothing But Net podcast, the podcast for triple net commercial real estate investing. I'm your host, Adam Carswell, joined by co-host Michael Flight today. Thank you, and we will catch you in the next episode. Thank you once again for joining us here on Nothing But Net, the podcast for triple net commercial real estate investing. If you enjoyed what you heard today, one last friendly reminder to like, share, subscribe, or leave a review for us. It really helps a ton with the show's visibility. For the Nothing But Net team, I'm Adam Carswell. Take care.
Nothing but net.
The Nothing But Net podcast is not intended to provide legal, tax counsel, or accounting advice. Adam Carswell, Michael Flight, Concordia Realty Corporation, Liberty Real Estate Fund, LLC, and their affiliates do not provide tax, legal, or accounting advice or the worthiness and promotion of any particular investment. This material has been prepared for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. You should consult your own tax, legal, and accounting advisors before engaging in any transaction or undertaking. We highly encourage individuals and investors to seek the counsel of a qualified attorney as well as seek the counsel of a tax professional or certified public accountant to determine if there are any potential tax liabilities or consequences as a result of anything contained herein. All listeners of this podcast or video should understand that there are no guarantees of any success, outcome, or profitability of any transaction or undertaking, expressed or implied, and will not be liable for any financial or other losses or damages incurred as a result of any undertaking. Go to nothingbutnet.us for a complete set of disclosures. Thank you.